doing financing decision, part 3. What are the learning objectives? In this, we're going to study financing decision and the factors affecting it. Now, let us understand what financing decision is. Financing decision is concerned with the quantum of long-term sources. So, in financing decision, we decide the source and the proportion. So, long-term sources can either be debt or equity, and proportion can be what combination of debt and equity is the finance manager interested. Is it 2:1 or 1:1 or whatever the case may be. So financing decision is basically determining the source and the proportion of long-term finance. Now, to understand better what debt and equity is, let us evaluate the two. Now, equity is much more expensive than debt. Debt is definitely cheaper. And the risk in case of equity is much less. Though debt is cheaper, but the risk is more because you have to pay the interest on debt every 6 months. Whether you have profit or no profit, you have to pay the risk. And this risk is called financial risk. But in case of equity, if you don't have any profit, you don't have to pay any dividend. So therefore, the risk involved in case of debt is much more. Though debt is cheaper, the risk is more. Therefore, the finance manager has a choice between debt and equity, and he has to weigh the pros and cons of both. The mode of payment of equity is dividend, and the mode of payment of debt is interest. Now, let's do the factors affecting the financing decision. The first and the foremost factor is the cost. Now, as we know that equity is quite expensive, so if cost is the criteria, then the finance manager will go in for debt because debt is definitely cheaper. The second factor that he keeps in mind before deciding which source of long-term finance should he go in for is the risk. Again, this we've already studied that equity is not risky because you're not bound to pay the dividend, whereas debt is risky because the financial amount of finance has to be paid regularly. If you don't pay, then they can take you to the court. So debt is very risky and equity is not as risky as debt. And therefore, if risk is the criteria, then the finance manager will go in for equity. Then comes the floatation cost. Floatation cost is the cost of raising finance. Now, in case of debt, the floatation cost is much less. Let us take the example that if you want to raise long-term loan from a bank, so you go to the bank, they'll give you an application form, you fill it up, attach the required documents, go and submit it. And if they think that you deserve the loan, they'll give it to you. Otherwise, they'll say no. So that is all you need to do in case of debt. But in case of equity, you need to take out an advertisement in the newspaper, then get your securities listed in a stock exchange. It's a very long drawn out process. So the floatation cost of equity is more and the floatation cost of debt is less. So if floatation cost is the criteria, then the finance manager will go in for debt. Then comes the cash flow position of the company. Now, on debt you have to pay interest, and interest has to be paid in cash. So finance manager will go in for debt only when the cash flow position of the company is very strong. If the cash flow position is not strong, then in that case the finance manager will go in for equity, because you are not bound to pay dividend on equity. And even if the finance manager wants to pay dividend, then he can always issue bonus shares. Then the fifth point that he has to consider is fixed operating cost. Now, what is operating cost? Operating cost is the cost of running the business. Like, for example, that the rent that you pay, the salary, insurance, etc. So suppose you're paying a huge amount of rent for the building. So already operating cost is very high. Then if you issue debt, then you have to pay interest. So that will add to the cost. So if the operating cost is already very high, the finance manager will never go in for debt because that will add to the cost. He'll always go in for equity. But if the operating cost is low, let us say you have your own showroom, then in that case, you don't have to pay any rent. Then in that case, the finance manager can go in for debt. He can pay that interest obligation. Then control considerations. Now, the existing equity shareholders never want their control to be diluted. So if more equity is issued and the control becomes diluted, then the finance manager will never go in for equity. So if new equity shareholders dilute the control of the equity shareholders, then the finance manager will go in for debt. If it does not dilute, then he'll go in for equity. Now, let me explain this in detail with the help of an example. Suppose there are only 100 equity shareholders in an organization, and now more finance is to be raised, and the finance manager wants to issue 100 new shares, and that means 100 new equity shareholders. So there are 200 equity shareholders. So the control of the existing equity shareholders goes down to 50%. So the control is diluted. So in that case, the finance manager will go in for debt. Suppose there are 100 equity shareholders and you just need 10 more equity shareholders. So the original equity shareholders, their control is diluted just marginally. So then in that case, the finance manager will go in for equity because it is not diluting the control of the original equity shareholders. These were the factors that we had done. Now let us study the case study and see how well you're prepared to answer it. Now, as I told you earlier, that first we will read what is asked and then we'll read the case study looking for those particular points. Now here it says that you have to identify two financial decisions and the risk involved in arranging finance through the issue of debentures. Okay, so let's do the case study now. SKS Fasteners Limited produces screws on a mass scale. So the company's policy is that 3% could be defective. Over a 6 months period, it has observed that 10% of the total production is defective. The cause of deviation found is defective machinery. The company now wants to replace the defective machinery with a new one. The cost of the new machinery is over 5 crores. To arrange finance for the same, the company decides to issue rupees 5 lakh, 12% debentures of rupees 100 each to the public. So identify the two financial decisions and what is the risk involved. So though they're talking about defective, but it is not controlling because they're asking about the financial decisions. So let us look it up. Now they're talking about two financial decisions. So let us check it out. I hope you have found out what the two decisions are. So let me show you. Yes, the first decision is regarding replace the defective machinery. So when you are talking about replacing a defective machinery, then this decision is investment decision. And they've also decided to issue rupees 5,000, 12% debentures. So that is financing decision. And what are the risks involved? Now, when you're taking a financing decision and you're trying to raise debt, then the financial risk of raising debt, that is paying interest, is always there. So let's check it out. And the two decisions are investment decision and financing decision. An issue of debenture will increase the financial charges of the company, thereby increasing the financial risk. Thank you, children.